Hello students, this is Professor McDonald. What I'm going to do with these professor notes is not review the entire chapter with you. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights and hopefully give you a little overview of each chapter. I'll also throw in a question that you'll see in the test, so that's at least one reason to listen to these short audio clips. But again, I'm not going to go over the entire, you've got the slides, you can read a lot of these things yourself and understand them. You don't need me to explain them to you. However, let's hit a few of the things. If we go to chapter 1, it's about the evolution of policing and investigation. And put simply, modern policing is a relatively new concept. Prior to the introduction of police organizations that we know, people were responsible for their own protection. And the first policing efforts were very basic, and eventually they evolved over time when we saw the evolution of cities and the need for professional policing models that occurred. And of course, it started in England, just like our criminal justice system. The criminal justice system, the model that the Founding Fathers utilized in writing our Constitution, much of that came from England, as that was the first country really in the civilized world to develop what we would call police organizations. And in particular, the things that we're going to talk about will be criminal investigations. So from these early police organizations eventually evolved more professional organizations and the evolution of criminal investigators as members of those organizations whose task it was to solve crimes. Now, like I said, the early responses to crime, it was responsibility really in these, most people lived in small agrarian farming communities. The responsibility for any sort of reaction to being a victim of a crime was up to that individual. And many people had to, if you wanted something done, you had to take, so to speak, the law into your own hands. People depended upon themselves, their family members, and their neighbors for support if they became victimized, and also for protection. There's a term, and you might see this again as a hint, under the principle of what they call posse comitatus, which means the power or force of the community to enforce the laws. If you lived in a small town, all available citizens were expected to respond to protect the community. So if you lived in a small town and something occurred, you had an obligation as a citizen of that small community to respond and help your neighbors, help them look out for each other and protect the community as a whole. And so essentially, even if you go back to the British colonies before we became a nation ourselves, we used the colonists used the customs and the laws which had formed the basis of their own legal system in England. They used that here today. Our first police organizations here were formed after the London Metropolitan Police as well. As societies and cities started to grow, crime did exist. You have to understand that. I mean, there were thieves out there. There were robbers. We've all seen things on television. I mean, if you look at the United States in the Wild Wild West, there were a lot of folks out there that were committing crimes, and there was very little law enforcement or any reaction to it. And so that's where, again, like I mentioned, the term posse comitatus. You heard of the term posse. We're going to get together a posse to go after somebody. Even before that, the small cities and villages, they formed what they called the night watchmen, and they were individuals. The watchmen were supervised by a constable who was also a private citizen. Normally, he served as a voluntary position as part of his civic duty, and so you would have able-bodied males who were required to serve on a rotating basis, different shifts, without pay, as the night watchman. So if you lived in a small town, you were going to pull a tour as the night watchman without pay looking out for your fellow citizens, and there was normally somebody who was called the constable within the city who these individuals would report to. So who are they looking out for? They're patrolling the streets to make sure people aren't stealing, robberies, burglaries, assaults, these sort of things. So it's kind of like a citizen police department in a sense. And then from this evolution, if a citizen did identify an offender, since there was no police department to call, and the local community arrested that person would eventually be turned over to the local sheriff, who, in the Old England days, as law and order was developing, the sheriff was the chief law enforcement officer, and he represented the crown, which would be the king or the queen of England. So that's where the term sheriff comes from. It's connected back to England at the time when we started to see a need and a requirement within small towns and villages for some sort of law enforcement. And of course, as you'll read in the book, these eventually developed. The Bow Street Runners. Eventually in 1822, an individual by the name of Robert Peel became the first British Home Secretary. And he was responsible for internal security in England, and he was a strong advocate of establishing a police force to combat crime. And so eventually what you'll see is the City of London Metropolitan Police Department was formed, and so you start to see the beginnings of law enforcement. Now, American policing was designed on the British model, in particular the London Metropolitan Police Department. Now, there were problems with the early police departments. To be honest with you, they were corrupt. They were run, a lot of these towns were run by corrupt political machines operating under a spoils system. In other words, politicians extorted money from people and companies wanting to do business in the city, and many of these politicians became rich. And as a result, they corrupted the new police departments as well. So what you could possibly envision is the police helping the rich corrupt politicians make money, and of course getting paid off. And so what is essentially evolved was what they call the reform movement, where individuals came into power that realized that you cannot run a law enforcement organization if it's corrupt, because now it's the individuals working in that organization are just as bad as the thieves that are out on the street stealing from people. So that would be some more of your evolution. And again, you see this corrupt spoils system, you see this reform movement move in, and eventually you see the formation of a civil service system where individuals were checked out before they were hired. They had to take a test. You see policing become, the focus of policing is to serve the community on a nonpartisan basis. In other words, your political affiliation should have nothing to do with you doing your job. In other words, politics should be eliminated from policing. That was the problem with the early police departments. So better hiring, better standards. You see the development over time of a more professional organization in the 1930s here in the United States during the Great Depression. That also helped move policing towards better professionalism. In our book, they also talk about the development of, around this same time period, in the mid-1850s, as you see police departments being formed, going into the 1900s, you also see the development of forensic science. And that's the use of science to answer legal questions is known as forensics, a field of study that's developed over time. So you have scientists that are schooled in a variety of disciplines make meaningful contributions to the field of criminalistics. In other words, the application of scientific techniques in collecting and analyzing physical evidence. So this is very important to us as criminal investigators, and in particular in this course, because as you see forensic science develop, you see criminalistics develop, and so things like fingerprint analysis, being able to identify, being able to collect fingerprints at a crime scene, collect blood at a crime scene, use toxicology to try to connect individuals to the blood, or if poisons are used in a crime, identifying what poisons they are. As you see the science now supporting the investigative efforts to try to essentially identify individuals that are involved in crime. One of the key things, and you might want to remember this, they talk about in the book, is the exchange principle, and this is where forensics becomes important. It's believed when a criminal comes in contact with another person or an object, a cross-transfer of evidence occurred. Could be hair, could be fibers. In a rape case, you have semen that may be left at the scene, or if the victim is a female, semen that could be collected from her after the offense at the hospital where they do a rape kit. So you have fingerprints that could be left, hair, fibers, these sort of things. So that's the exchange principle. And so as police become more professional, they collect evidence, and you have forensics and you have science used to connect people to crimes. It's pretty simple. And we'll get into much more depth of that as the semester progresses. The last area I want to cover is, from a criminal investigation standpoint, we have 3 levels of criminal investigators here in the United States. We have the local level, that would be your city police department, like Laurinburg, Pembroke, Raleigh, Durham. Most towns have their own individual police department. They have jurisdiction over crimes that exist within their venue. In other words, if a crime in Pembroke happens or occurs within the city limits of Pembroke, then a criminal investigator for Pembroke or a detective would do that investigation. And their jurisdiction normally is limited to the area where they work. If you also have state policing. We have the State Bureau of Investigation, which is a criminal investigative organization. We have the Highway Patrol, which enforces traffic laws. These are state-level agencies. Their jurisdiction would be within the entire state of North Carolina. The third levels are federal investigative agencies. I worked at the federal level with 2 agencies, and our area of responsibility, I could make arrests across state lines. My jurisdiction could extend anywhere within the continental United States. I couldn't go into France and arrest somebody, but I could, if I was working a case in North Carolina and my suspect was in South Carolina, I could effect an arrest there and actually continue with my investigation there. Now, most federal law enforcement organizations have different offices spread throughout the country, and we had geographical responsibility. But the bottom line is a federal agent does have authority to make arrest anywhere within the federal, let's say the continental United States, within the 50 states and its territories. The book talks about some of the agencies. The oldest one is the Marshal Service, created in 1789. And the U.S. Marshals, they arrest fugitives. They also are responsible for court security in the federal court system. They're the bailiffs at the federal level. The Postal Inspection Service, they can trace their roots back to 1830 with the creation of the Office of Instructions in Mail Depredations. They were special agents at the time. They investigated the theft of mail, mail frauds, a mailing of obscene material, etc. And so think about in the 1850s, you had guys like Jesse James out there robbing trains with mail, that sort of thing. Postal inspectors, or special agents as they were called at the time, would be involved in those investigations. The Secret Service is mentioned. They're involved obviously in protection duties relative to the president, the vice president, and other dignitaries. They also do financial investigations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, which was created in 1908, they have about 200 statutes they enforce. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is mentioned. They do tax collecting enforcement. They're the regulatory arm of the U.S. Department of Treasury. They're also involved in bomb investigations, racketeering, relative to gun running, these sort of cases. And then the last one mentioned was DEA, the Drug Administration, Enforcement Administration, and their job is the investigation of drug cases, importation of drugs into the United States, illegal drugs. So these are some of the agencies. There's a lot more agencies than that. So that kind of gives you a quick overview of Chapter 1, and that'll be the end of this tape.